Good evening. Good to see you. As we approach the Christmas season, the history of the period of time during which Christ was born, oftentimes the culture and so forth that surrounded the birth of Christ often is not mentioned much at all. And yet there's a verse in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, that makes a pretty pronounced statement. It says, when the fullness of time was come, what happened? God sent forth his Son. And the first part of that's what I'd like to share some thoughts with you about tonight. When the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son. Also in Mark chapter 1, verse 15, John the Baptist refers to the same concept that history was set perfectly for the coming of Christ. Now, sometimes we raise questions about that. We say, well, why was there no room for him in the end and that sort of thing? And we'll talk about that in the next couple Wednesday nights. We talk about no room in the end. Because Christ didn't come as the King of Kings. He came as the Lamb to be slain for our sins. And so where the manger was an appropriate place for him to be. God doesn't make any mistakes. But the process here of this verse, Galatians 4:4, that Paul's talking about, there are three particular things I want to look with you tonight at. First of all, the political environment, the intellectual environment, and the religious contributions that paved the way for the successful, not only the birth of Christ, but also the spread of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let's look at the political aspects first. We talk about the Roman government, and the Roman government probably is the most significant of the three governments that we will be talking about. The Roman government, the Greeks, the Romans, the Greeks, and the Jews. And each one made contributions, but the Roman government made the largest contribution. And sometimes what happens is God works in ways that we don't think about at all. He can actually use the negative. He can use those who are working against the gospel. He can use those that are working against him to bring honor and praise and glory to himself. He has the ability to do that. We can take something that's good and use it pretty effectively, but turning something negative into something positive is often a challenge for us as human beings. If you look at the outline there, I want to look at political contributions. First of all, there was a sense of unity of mankind. The one thing that the Romans were good at doing, and the one thing that they did that many of the cultures prior to them were not able to do, and many of the cultures after them were not able to do, was to establish a sense of unity among the people. Prior to that period of time, there were little small areas, towns, villages, groups of people and so forth, and they were constantly at each other's throats, trying to basically conquer each other and that sort of thing. But when the Romans came along, the Romans basically were able to, by virtue of creation of a government and an organization, to do what had not been able to be done before. And that was interestingly enough, by God's design. I'm not suggesting God approved of everything the Romans did, but God controls the world, and he's in charge in a real sense. No empire of the ancient Near East, not even the empire of Alexander, had succeeded in bringing men to a sense of unity or in political organization. There was constant infighting, constant countries fighting against each other. But as the Romans came in, they were able to establish a sense of control and a sense of power and a sense of unity. And that may sound a little bit strange when we think about later on when they began to persecute the Christians and so forth. But the application of Roman law. And Roman law applied to all individuals. When the Romans would go into an area and they would conquer it, basically, they would send troops in to patrol for a period of time to make sure that no insurrections would occur. And then every 2 years they would move that group to another town. And then they'd move them to another town. And so they were in constant rotation. And of course the reason for that was, and I think you're familiar with why they did that, they wanted to make sure that the soldiers didn't get too comfortable with the local people. Because if they did, then they might not stop an insurrection fast enough. And so the Roman soldiers, basically, we'll talk about them in just a couple of minutes. But the Romans also had a legal system that was second to none. In fact, we've copied much of their legal system in our country today, although it seems to be kind of dissipating a little bit. They developed 12 tablets of law that were essential to Roman life. And the interesting thing about the Romans is that as they expanded their empire and continued to build their empire, all those territories that they basically were able to conquer, the Roman law followed those conquests. That was that sense of unity that they wanted to establish among the people. Now, they also had in their court system an aspect where the law of the local people, if there was a local law, they paid attention to that, and there was basically a judge that was responsible for going into that community and listening if there were certain law cases that came up that were peculiar to that culture itself. So that judge would go in and sit in the court, listen to the local law, then make a determination. But there was a sense of fairness among the legal aspects of the Roman government. There's also an element of the Roman culture that became extremely important to the Apostle Paul. They would grant citizenship to non-citizens. They would grant citizenship to non-citizens. You remember the Apostle Paul one time, he was arrested and they were going to beat him, and his comment was what? Is that the way you treat a Roman citizen? Stop. Okay? They stopped immediately because Roman citizens had rights that basically other people didn't have. And if they were a Roman citizen, there was a legal aspect that needed to be followed. So the law system that they had, the citizenship, basically became a means of creating a sense of unity. There was a sense of, even though you were a conquered nation, if you were under the umbrella of the Romans, there was a sense of protection there. You had some rights. So that sense of unity was unknown up until the time of the Roman Empire, especially the Pax Romana, the 200-year period of peace that existed. And that's the next point. There was about 200 years called the Pax Romana of peace, where there was a sense of very little fighting. Well, I say very little fighting. The Romans kept expanding their empire, but basically there was a sense of pulling together a government and pulling together even the conquered countries into the Roman Empire. The Roman roads, that's a story in itself. The Romans learned from the Greeks. In history, there's a statement that I'm sure you've probably heard. It goes like this: the Greeks had the brains and the Romans had the drains. All right? Now I'll explain that. The Greeks were creative. They were the minds. They were brilliant people. In fact, many of the Roman aristocracy had Greek teachers teaching their children. But the Greeks were the minds. But the Romans were the individuals who could take the ideas and translate them into building. The aqueducts, the Roman roads. They had a sewer system. They had a water system. Their systems of design in terms of architecture and so forth were unparalleled and still stand today. some of the roads that they designed during that period of time are still functioning today because they were made out of concrete. Creative people. As we look at the gospel of Jesus Christ, another statement rings true. The statement is, all roads lead, what? All roads lead to Rome. That's no joke because they ran for hundreds of miles. They were first-class roads and they were maintained. But the same roads that led to Rome led away from Rome. Militarily, that becomes an important issue because over those roads, the Appian Way and other major thoroughfares that they had, they could send troops. Blitzkrieg. Hitler actually copied some of the concepts of the Roman roads. So interesting, they would simply, the roads would run out and they were well designed, well built, made of concrete and stone. And along those roads would be towns and cities. And so they would have access to towns and cities. So the Christians, think about that. The missionaries, the Apostle Paul again and again would refer to Roman roads. He would go to a city. And the transportation process using those roads was very simple. But it was also safe because before the Romans took over, you go from one area to another area, there was an issue of risk. Safety was involved. But the Roman roads were a primary means of distributing the gospel and allowing the disciples and allowing the Christians 100 years after Christ to continue to reach out and to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. Then there was the Roman army. And Rome, of course, was known for its military might. The Apostle Paul, you'll remember, he wanted to go to Rome. And in talking to the church at Philippi, he wanted to visit the church at Philippi. But most of all, he wanted to go to Rome. And when Paul went to Rome, he always went to the synagogues first to present the gospel and to talk to those that were there. Well, God sent him a message, in effect. He said, Paul, you can go to Rome. You're not going to go the way you'd like to go. You're going to go the way I want you to go. You're going to go in chains. You're going to go as a prisoner. Now remember the fact that the Apostle Paul was a Roman citizen, so he was entitled to the very best defense. And if he was accused, he had the opportunity to appear before in court and basically to protect himself and be protected by the Roman law. So the Lord said, fine, you can go to Rome, but you're going to go in chains. Well, that's kind of an interesting shift, isn't it? We think of that as what? Positive or negative? We think of it as negative. God said it's positive. Because he was a Roman citizen, because they wanted to protect him from being assassinated or killed, they assigned the Praetorian Guard to the Apostle Paul. Now, the Praetorian Guard was basically made up of 2,000 soldiers who were the very elite of the elitist. They were the individuals who protected the Caesar. They were the individuals who also protected the members of the Senate or any political individuals who were significant in the government of the Caesar. Now, when they were assigned to the Apostle Paul, the Praetorian Guard were assigned in 2-hour intervals. Okay? They would come, spend 2 hours, then they would go, be relieved by another Praetorian Guard who would come and replace them. Can you imagine if you were a Praetorian Guard being chained to the Apostle Paul for 2 hours? That was great for Paul. It was kind of like instead of going to visit them, they came to visit him. And so basically what he did was he shared the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. Satan sometimes in the process of trying to undermine God falls right into the hand of what God wants to accomplish. Let me share with you, this is a book called History of the Western World by Cheney. And it looks like it's been through the war, doesn't it? Okay. I bought this book when I started teaching. In fact, Ken and I started teaching at the same time, different locale in Maryland. And I came across this book, and I've held on to it. But he talks a little bit here about, on page 61, he talks about the army. Let me just turn here for just a second and read that to you. And the print's smaller in this. It was a North American Christian scholar and lawyer named Tertullian, the son of a centurion, who mocked the pagan idolaters. The images of your God, he wrote, are mere nesting places for mice and hawks and spiders. You sell your own household gods and even pawn them for money. We Christians, men and women, are but of yesterday, and yet we have crowded your cities, your fortresses, your camps, your palaces, your assemblies, your Senate house, your courts. All we have left to you are your temples. If we packed up our belongings and departed for some distant land, the solitude and loneliness of your world would terrify you. How do you like that comment? That gives us a snapshot of the impact that the gospel message had on the Roman Empire. Sometimes we think of the Roman Empire as pagan, as ungodly, and it was. And yet God used the soldiers who came to know Christ, and every 2 years the soldiers were moved. If they were in a city, in an area, they were constantly moved to a new location so that there couldn't be an insurrection. So God had a plan, and the plan works really well. It's a little bit like federal prison wardens. Interestingly enough, they're changed every 2 years. They're rotated every 2 years. And you may think, well, that's a waste of time. No, if you rotate every 2 years, basically, they all have different skills and abilities. So you find a way to improve the system, theoretically, that way. The Roman army was a channel that God used to deliver the gospel around the Roman Empire. Let's go to, under political contributions, the Romans contributed a sense of unity for mankind, so that when the gospel was presented, and we talk about what? Being unified, coming together as believers, the family of God. They had a sense of what that was about. The period of peace, Pax Romana, enabled the gospel to spread throughout the Roman world. Very quickly, Roman roads made that possible, and the Roman army many of them became missionaries. As they moved from area to area, they shared with others the gospel of Jesus Christ. So let's go to intellectual contributions. The first one is a universal language. During this period of time, all kinds of dialects existed. But as a result of this period, during this period of time, because of Rome and because of the Romans, there were changes that occurred. The English language, of course, is known. Most people around the world speak the English language, or did speak the English language. But in this case, basically, most of the individuals, many of them spoke Greek. And there was classical Greek, but there was also just the average Greek that the man in the street spoke. And just recently, over the last, 25 years, they've discovered that the New Testament was written in the Greek that the average person would speak. And so that contributed to its spread and understanding. But the universal language made it possible to communicate the gospel clearly and spread it very quickly across the Roman Empire. The Greek culture, let's take a look at that for a minute in terms of intellectual contributions. The Greek philosophers, basically, their position was against the gospel of Jesus Christ. They're negative. It's a negative influence, and yet God was able to turn that in terms of a positive aspect as well. Their philosophy of the Greeks failed to satisfy their spiritual needs. So basically what happened was they became dissatisfied with the religion that they had experienced and they had been exposed to. And even Plato spoke out against the religion. The bankruptcy or philosophy of the time caused individuals to begin to look for a spiritual solution, something that could make a difference in their life. And there was a sense of emptiness. St. Augustine made a comment sometime later in history. He said, "Thou hast made us for thyself, O God, and our hearts are restless till they find their rest in thee." And that's exactly what happened as a result of the Greek culture. These people were brilliant. Their minds were brilliant. They liked to think. They liked to discuss. They liked to argue. They would not call it arguing. They call it discussion. And there's a difference. Argument is exchange of ignorance. Discussion is an exchange of knowledge, right? So they liked to discuss, but they would stand for long periods of time and have discussions. Guess who loved to do that? The person who was trained to do it. At the feet of Gamaliel, the Apostle Paul loved to do that. And he could stand and he could discuss with them strategic issues again and again and again. But the Greek culture, that sense of emptiness was there. That sense of loss was there. It reminds me a little bit about a scripture that says, ever learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Because religion has a sense of seeming to solve and fill a gap. But after a while it begins to evaporate, and religion leaves the individual with a sense of continued emptiness. And so they search again. Fill it with something. Emptiness occurs. Search, fill, search, fill. And that's what happened in terms of the Greek culture. They were looking for opportunities to find something that would fill their spiritual need. Socrates and Plato, during that period of time, made an interesting comment about the religious culture and the culture of the Greeks. He said they insisted the reality was not temporal but material. Was not material or temporal but spiritual and eternal. Their search for the truth never led them to a personal God, but it demonstrated that the best man could do in seeking God was through the intellect, and that wasn't adequate to meet man's need. Let's go to the third area, the religious contributions. The Romans basically were first. Their conquests, as they began to expand, the Roman government, as they began to expand and they reached out and they conquered nations surrounding them, many of these nations whose gods they accounted on for protection from the Romans, what they discovered was their gods were made of wood, hay, stubble, that sort of thing. They couldn't protect them. And so what happened was, as a result of being captured by the Romans, they began to lose faith in their gods. They said the gods didn't protect us. The gods didn't take care of us. They're not capable of doing that. So basically it created a sense of abandonment of their gods that before, made of wood and stone and that sort of thing, they gave up and they began to say, they can't help us. They can't change our lives. And so even the aspect of even down as far as Egypt, basically. Isis, one of the goddesses or gods of Egypt, basically believed in death and the resurrection. So the concept of many of the false religious groups believed concepts that were historically and become historically Christian. And so it was much easier for the Romans and the Greeks to understand and begin to believe the gospel once it came. It filled a gap. It filled a gap that they had. The Greek religions, people turned to philosophy. And the Greeks were well known for their philosophy. The concept of man's capability of saving themselves or taking care of themselves, changing their lives and so forth. Both the Greek and the Roman systems of philosophy and religion made negative contributions to the coming of Christianity by destroying the old concepts of polytheism and creation of idols. The Jewish religion made a contribution. It's interesting that we think of Christianity and we think of Judaism. Christianity is basically, its roots are in Judaism. Francis Schaeffer made a comment. He said, Christianity is Jewish. That's true. That's true. But the Jews basically, there were several contributions that they made that made a difference in terms of Christianity being rooted and grounded. Judaism existed in striking contrast to the pagan religions of the day because the Jews believed in one God instead of many gods. The second thing, Jews offered the world a hope of a coming Messiah. The third thing is that they also had a pure ethical system that they followed. The wise men appeared in Jerusalem shortly after the birth of Christ. They had some knowledge about the potential of the coming of a Messiah. And so the Jews contributed also to the coming of Christ in the sense that they were looking forward to the aspect of him coming. They also had the Old Testament. And interestingly enough, many of the Gentiles during that period of time were very much aware of the Old Testament. And some of them basically became proselytes of the Jewish faith. The Jews also provided one other thing that made it possible for Christianity to spread. And the Apostle Paul took advantage of this at the very outset. They had synagogues wherever they were living, wherever they were, the groups of Jews. The synagogue, which was the central place of religion, the central place of fellowship and worship and so forth. And it was there that the Apostle Paul, every time he went into a city, into a town, that's where he would go first. He would go to the synagogues, and he would sit and he would dispute with them, and he would share the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we can say that basically some of the negative aspects of the Roman Empire, some of the negative aspects of the Greek culture contributed to the effectiveness and the opportunity for the spread of the gospel of Jesus Christ. God does things sometimes much differently than we would do it. As I was putting this together, I was thinking about our current political situation. And you look, I don't know about you, but I look at it and just shake your head. Every day it gets a little worse. And yet, if we look at when the birth of Christ occurred in the culture and the environment in which he was born, God had already set all that up, basically, so that it would be successful. And God has a plan, and that plan will always be fulfilled. But sometimes it's hard to see the plan. because we see all the negative aspects of it. But he told us what was going to happen. He said, you know, it's going to get worse, worse, and worse, and worse. And it's happening. Let me just go to a couple of applications here very quickly. God has a plan that is perfect for his creation, and his timing is perfect. As Paul says in Galatians 4:4, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son. God sees each of us as part of his plan that know him as our personal Savior, because he wants us to contribute to the growth of each other, to support each other, because we're part of the family of God. We are also part of the big picture of his plan of redemption and of his timing in our individual lives. It's going to be interesting, I think, when we get to heaven, when God kind of rolls out and shows us our we look back in terms of our life, and we see how God, even in negative circumstances, used those negative circumstances to share us and to mold us into the kind of person he wanted us to be. The opportunities that he gave us that perhaps in some instances we didn't want. We said, why, God? Why did you allow that to happen? Why did you allow me to be in that situation? Why did you bring this change into my life? And I think at that point, very often we're going to be able to look and see that there was a reason. What to us was a negative experience, he designed as part of the plan for our lives to have an impact on somebody else, but also to have an impact on our lives. The birth of Christ, God's perfect timing. He's never early, he's never late. Thank you.